Have you ever been immersed by a video game? So deeply engrossed that even for just a moment, you genuinely believe that you were living in that environment. Maybe the game looked particularly pretty, absolutely breathtaking. Maybe the characters were so well written that they felt like real people, people that you know. Perhaps the sounds and music of a game were the thing that really put you in the game itself. This, of course, is a pretty stupid question. If you've played games for longer than about 15 seconds, odds are you have been immersed by them. The developer of a game needs to very carefully consider how best to immerse their players in the game that they create. And truthfully, there's an almost infinite number of ways a developer can get a player immersed into a game. But only as of very recently, there's been something of a new kid on the block. What if you, as a player of the game, were a character inside the game itself? And by extension, the real world we all inhabit had story significance inside of that game. What if, in some way, the game you were playing knew it was being played? Spoilers for the first hour of One Shot and I'm Scared will be present in this video. You have been warned. Okay, so before we actually get started here, I need to lay down some ground rules. The subject of this video is going to largely talk about meta moments in video games. The term meta surrounding video games can get pretty ambiguous. So just for the record, and if you decide to do your own research into the topic, no, I'm not talking about like the current meta of a video game in a competitive sense. I'm also not talking about sub-modes in video games, also known as metagaming. What I'm talking about is more analogous to breaking the fourth wall, which is another topic that is related mostly to this topic. And for the purposes of this video, a meta moment in a video game is any point where the game acknowledges that it has a player, whether this be through the characters themselves or the game itself. Essentially, you as the player become a character in the game, as in you, the actual person playing the game, is being sort of winked at or nudged at that yes, the game can see you, and it acknowledges your existence. I also just want to take this time real quick to acknowledge the elephant in the room. An extremely easy example of something like this would obviously be a game like Undertale. But almost purely for the sake of not mentioning Undertale, because bringing that game into a discussion is like summoning an eldritch demon, I will not be mentioning it here. On the other hand, I also just don't think I have anything that I can really add to the discussion there. The game has been talked about to death, and there are plenty of other well-produced videos on that game just in and of itself. I'm also well aware that there are a lot of people who do not have a very high opinion of Undertale. So again, as long as it's not necessary, I'm not going to mention it. That being said, if you want a more Undertale-focused video, and you find yourself as a person who doesn't really get the hype but wants to understand it still just for the sake of it, there's an absolutely wonderful video by Andrew Cunningham. He details how the game was just special to him and to so many other players. It's genuinely a good watch, and it's specifically meant for the type of person who just doesn't get Undertale but is willing to learn still. He's an infinitely talented creator that can make a much better video than anything I could even imagine. And also, in my opinion, he's just sort of a master of dry humor. So if that's your thing, then check it out. It's a good watch. The purpose of this video is to purely break down what makes these meta fourth wall breaking moments work. Why are they effective? Why do devs decide to use them? And arguably most importantly, what will their effect be in the future if devs continue to use them? I'd like to pull from examples of games that I have personally played or know about, purely for the reason of highlighting their differences and similarities. And also, I just want to talk about games that I think are really cool. And speaking of cool games, One Shot is a borderline life-changing experience.
Thanks.
It's a top-down exploration puzzle game produced by Night Margin on the RPG Maker game engine. But obviously, with its presence in this video, its most important quality is how it bends and twists and scatters the fourth wall in just about every moment that you're playing it. How I opened the video just a couple minutes ago is verbatim how the game itself opens, with the whole computer talking to you and everything else. And not even 1 minute later, the game asks you what your real name is. The only real observation you can make at this point if you've never played this game before is that things are gonna get pretty weird. The character you quote-unquote play as is named Nico, and they're a cute little cat person. Things as simple as your control over Nico are explained through the game's story. You're essentially imparting your will onto Nico. Every decision you make, they also make, and they're in immediate agreement there. The little light bulb that Nico is holding is this world's sun. It's supposed to be the light in the sky, and you can tell just with that statement, it's pretty important. So, don't do anything stupid with it. Because the game will call you out on this. Several characters in the game, including Nico, address you as their god. And Nico will go out of their way to contact you if they need help with something, or if they just want to chat. Immediately, this game establishes that it wants to endear you to the world and the characters, Nico chief among them. There isn't any combat or anything despite this being made on RPG Maker. And there's a narrative reason for that too, but that's not important to talk about here. Despite the lack of any immediate danger, there's a somber feeling all throughout the game. The music helps convey this, and all the character dialogue does too. The only literal ray of sunlight going on in this game right now is Nico and the sun that they are holding. Nico, in every aspect of the word, is an innocent little creature. You immediately feel the need to protect them against any and all threats, existential or otherwise. It's despite this lack of inherent danger that the game is going to constantly pull its one trump card. A very effective trump card. Whatever this entity inside the computer is, it does not want you to complete your mission. And instead of being endeared to the character behind the computer, or being the computer, they instead taunt you. It is here where I want to highlight the two, for lack of a better term, secret ingredients for as to why meta moments work in games. Our first one, in a single all-encompassing word, is vulnerability. There are two sides in this case of vulnerability. Not only is the world itself quite vulnerable, obviously it's on the brink of destruction, and you need to take careful actions in order to get it back on track. But also, in many other cases, you as the player are left quite vulnerable. Suddenly your ability to launch an executable file is sort of nerfed. If you decide to close out of the game for whatever reason, depending on the game itself, you might be hurting or scaring some of these characters. If nothing else, they know of your absence. So all of a sudden, the safety guard of the video game being a video game doesn't really work here. Or rather, you feel like it doesn't. Obviously, of course, if you're thinking objectively, none of this is real. But in the moment, being remarked with your name, it sort of leaves you uneasy. There's an uncertainty about everything. A lot of video essayists like to do this thing where they throw around the term suspension of disbelief. But has anybody ever taken the time to really deconstruct what that means? Any and all pieces of media are purely fictional. They are not real. But in order to hook you into the story, you need to be immersed in it. You need to believe that it's real. Most games will try their hardest to make you believe that this fictional world is more than fiction. And as I've expressed before, they can go about this in about 160,000 different ways. Don't quote me on that number, I'm just throwing numbers out there. The meaning for suspension of disbelief is sort of in the name. You are suspending your disbelief. If something scares you in a horror game, you genuinely felt afraid, even if it was just like a quick jump scare or something. Some part of your intrinsic human functions told you that you were in danger. If your favorite character dies in a video game, you might shed a tear or two. And that's because, for even a moment, you believe that they died. Of course none of this is real, but suspension of disbelief tells you otherwise. You believe it anyway. And these more meta moments in games go out of their way to basically just punch down that fourth wall. Literally, it's like a direct sucker punch immediately into your emotions. And suddenly, like with what I was saying about vulnerability, the stakes have been amped up out of nowhere. A game with meta elements might go out of their way to change something about your desktop. Maybe they change the wallpaper, or maybe they create a new text file. And specifically in the case of One Shot, it does the text document thing, and it throws it into the document section of your computer. This is admittedly a very tiny detail. It could have thrown it in the game files, but it makes the game seem so much more aware than it actually is, because now it has personally intruded into your territory. Your digital safety net has suddenly been cut. And now you, as an active participant in the story, is suddenly motivated by whatever's going on because of the game's deliberate know-how into how you are an outside acting force. As the player of any game, you drive the ship forward. And if a game suddenly becomes aware of that, it makes your actions seem a lot more permanent, maybe. They certainly have an elevated level of importance, if nothing else. And see, it would be one thing if One Shot just did this once or twice. But no, practically the moment you open up the game, you are now suddenly an actor in its story. And you never really feel numb to it. At least not on the first playthrough. I wish I could give a real concrete example, but as it stands, I don't want to spoil. Did it make you fall for it? Did you go and check the video? Now, truthfully, the reason I did this little joke was actually twofold. On the one hand, I thought it was funny, which actually is pretty important if you're a dev considering using meta moments. You can see it as a joke at the player's expense, but instead of it being particularly offensive or anything, it's more like a friendly jab in the shoulder from your friend or something. They might have made a slightly insensitive joke towards you, and instead of taking offense to it or anything, you just kinda laughed it off. Maybe it made you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but ultimately you're not gonna care in the next 10 minutes. And then secondly, obviously YouTube videos are not supposed to do that. I emulated the effect of a YouTube video buffering while talking over it, specifically to get you to pay attention. And me talking over the buffer was a little bit weird. It makes this video seem a little bit more self-aware, and in its own way is kind of meta. If it works to the effect that I hope it did, then it made you interact with the video, and now you're sort of in on the joke. But a third thing it might have done is maybe possibly made you a little bit uncomfortable. And that's going to perfectly lead into our second game, and our second secret ingredient. IMSCARED is a pixelated first-person horror game, developed by Ivan Sanity on the Game Maker engine. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm doing the time loop thing, but for video. But obviously, for the purposes of this video, it uses its fourth wall breaking moments to convey the overall theme of horror. In IMSCARED's specific case, it more or less holds you hostage the longer you play the game. The most immediate example of this is the game crashing on you, purposefully. And the game crashing here serves a specific intent. Because now, whenever you open up the game, right after it crashes, there's a sense of dread. You don't know what's going to happen, you don't know where you're going to be placed. You don't know what will happen to you. And practically just like with One Shot, there's text file shenanigans happening here as well. Quite a bit more than One Shot, actually. In fact, it gets to the point where the game deliberately tells you, as soon as you boot it up for the first time, that some antivirus software will flag it as a virus. Which, for one, wow, okay, what the fuck, this is nuts. But also, this means that the game can do some pretty weird and inventive things with breaking the meta. And how in this game's case, breaking the meta can assist with the themes of horror. It is here where I want to introduce our second secret ingredient. Given how we're playing a horror game right now, vulnerability is obviously pretty important. But the second, just as important thing in my opinion, that all of these games do, is convey themes of fear. The term fear here is obviously getting stretched a little bit. Truthfully, I just wanted something sort of punchy sounding for the sake of the secret ingredient naming scheme. If you wanted to, you could come up with other alternatives as opposed to just saying fear in general. Perhaps you could go with discomfort, some synonym for the word. The point is, games are not supposed to do stuff like this. But it's precisely because all of these weird meta-breaking shenanigans from every single one of these games can hit you with an indescribable amount of immersion. Whiteface, the main antagonist of this game, and the literal face of this game, would not be nearly as impactful as he is if there wasn't some sort of meta stuff going on. He's something of an icon, practically. At least in some small circles. And truthfully, if this game didn't have any of its fourth wall breaking stuff going on, then this game arguably would have just fallen by the wayside of other weird tiny walking simulator horror games. Breaking the meta is the magic that makes this stuff work, makes these games work. Think back on that fear point that I made. If you consider Whiteface for a second, and also the computer in One Shot, they just seem so much more powerful. Like the executable file that tried to contain them just didn't work. They already broke out of it, well before you started the game. And you know what? Actually, scratch that. They didn't break anything. It would be far more accurate to say that they are masters of their domain, of their cage they were placed in. And you have no other feeling other than to be woefully ill-prepared for whatever's going on, whatever they have planned for you. And that's because, once again, the game sees you. The game knows it has a player. You are nothing more than an actor in this game, in this proverbial play that's going on. You are a character now, whether or not you wanted to be. Anytime a malevolent force does something in one of these games, you can't help but get your mind racing at the possibilities of what they're gonna do next. There's literally a part in I'm Scared where the game itself opens a YouTube page to a tutorial on how to get past a puzzle, because there would have been no other way to solve it on your own. What else could you think at this point other than, oh god, what else is it gonna do? Does it have the ability to connect to the internet? For even a Planck length of time, you might have forgotten that this is a video game. Some part of you, theoretically, could tell you that what you're doing is releasing a virus out into the world with this one action. And even if none of that is the case, once again, it's just unnerving. Games should not be able to do this. But then, that might just beg the question. What if a meta-narrative isn't handled so well? What happens when it falls on its face? And what happens if your disbelief is no longer suspended? There's an underlying topic in this discussion that I don't see many people bring up. What if the meta elements in these games don't work for you? What if, for one reason or another, they sorta cheapen the experience? Moreover, depending on how you feel about games with meta aspects in them, somehow these games can simultaneously make the game seem much wider and much more shallow than it actually is. If you dislike meta-breaking elements, then obviously the game itself is going to just be like a self-contained little thing. If the game is being made aware that it isn't real, and it's telling you that to your face, then all it's doing is reinstating your disbelief. It's vindicating your disbelief in a way. And with this, the game is reminding you that it is merely a video game. The mental gymnastics here to sort of make it to where you can feel a video game is almost entirely being shut down in this case. But on the other hand, if you quite like these games and like the meta-breaking elements, then it can make the real world a part of the story. The game's world is now partially the real world. because of its self-aware nature. A very real issue surrounding the enjoyment of these games is that some people just don't like them. And really, there's no way to fix that. Because if meta elements are important to a game, they really can't be just removed or ignored. They are meant to call attention to themselves. And what's more, whether or not you like them is simply a personal taste thing. One could see these meta-breaking elements as sort of underhanded. A cheap trick, almost. And if you're thinking objectively, honestly, they kind of are. But I think the fact that they're a cheap trick doesn't necessarily ruin their efficacy. What's similarly interesting is that meta-breaking elements in games isn't exactly a new concept either, and breaking the fourth wall dates even further back than that. If a character tells you to hit the X button to interact with something, they have broken the fourth wall. This by itself doesn't necessarily mean too much. They are breaking the fourth wall in order to tell you a game mechanic. It becomes meta whenever another character questions, "What's the X button? What are you talking about?" And that's when things start to get kinda weird. But just with that one action by itself, it made the game world smaller. And yet it does this in service of making the real world a part of the story. And if not that, it makes the player a part of the story. And these more meta moments in games go out of their way to basically just punch down that fourth wall. Literally, it's like a direct sucker punch immediately into your emotions. Let's wrap this thing up. I'd like to close us out here with a metaphor. Say you're playing a much more conventional video game. It's written well, and its mechanics are on point. It might also just be one of your favorite games of all time. One could say that it has you in something of a chokehold, or maybe an armbar, a specific technique used in competition fights that just, typically whenever it lands, it wins the competition. Its applications are pretty varied, but ultimately, you need to have some sort of setup first before you're able to actually use it. If used correctly, this technique might be the exact thing that you need in order to win. But like with any technique involving competition fighting, there are risks involved. Maybe it's not the best option right now. Maybe a far more simpler, more underhanded tactic, as long as it's not frowned upon, would be a better idea. Fourth wall breaks to me really are sucker punches. They're frowned upon in certain circles, they're not particularly graceful, but they always come out of nowhere. And as long as they're not used too often, too predictably, the sucker punch could truly prove itself to be its own nuanced method of winning. And to me, meta moments do the exact same thing. They're really not that graceful. If they're overused, it could cheapen the whole game. But deliberate and careful application really does rise the whole experience up. It makes a completely unique experience. One that's almost always guaranteed to stay with you. You'll make memories with these games. You'll meet new friends. And despite none of it being real, it feels like it is. Every game is fictional after all. But if a game can make you believe that it's real, then the developers did their job. They immersed you. And that's all that really matters. Games like these have a truly profound effect on people. Since getting the one-shot footage, I feel obligated to complete the game again. I kinda left Nico hanging, and I feel bad for that. That's the effect that these games have. It's strong and resonant, and they absolutely could be the kinds of games that you remember for the rest of your life. The devs who make these games need to be very careful to not overdo it. The more of these types of games that come out, the more they like to use these meta breaks. And over time, we're all going to be a little bit more numb to it. The people behind these games need to continue to innovate on this idea. We've seen games read your PC name before, so just change it up some. Do something new. Continue the flow of creativity or whatever. The point is, I guess, these games are special. And I just like them a lot. I hope you enjoyed this weird set of nonsensical rants, and thank you for watching.